some latecomers coming in after lunch. It's always a difficult session to start. Firstly, thank you all for coming. This is the first time we've had a special panel for the Philippines. The first thing you probably notice is that I'm not Senator Bam Aquino. He really wanted to be here. He's very busy in the Philippines, as well as being a youth leader and leading social entrepreneur. He is now in politics. Most of you will probably know who the new president is of the Philippines. It's been in the news, but you probably don't know who the new vice president of the Philippines is yet. And he is still in the Philippines, actively part of that campaigning to decide who will be the vice president. We have, though, a very good panel today, people with a lot of experience who will be able to explain and give you an insight as to what is happening. I will ask the panelists to spend maybe 5 to 7 minutes introducing themselves, talking about their organization and their work. We'll then have a few questions, but I would like to encourage very much an interactive dialogue and for you to ask questions from the benefit of the country you're from or the sector you're from, as well as learning more about the Philippines. My own background is I come from the financial sector, from private equity. I've been with AVPM for 4.5 years. I was the first chief executive, so I helped to do a lot of the initial marketing that has allowed Nina then to build up the organization. So could you please welcome our panelists with a round of applause? And I'll ask Joanna to introduce herself, her name, organization. Thank you.
Hello. There. Everyone hear me? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Joanna Lao. I'm from Jollibee Group Foundation. It's the corporate social responsibility arm of Jollibee Foods Corporation. So before I talk about the things that we do in social issues and development, I think I'll begin with talking about our parent company because it has a lot to do with the kind of work that we go into. The company was started by our founders, Tony and Grace Tangkak Tiong, in 1975. They started with a small ice cream parlors, really small, so just a family business. And then from there it grew because people would come in for ice cream and then they'd look for hot meals, so they branched out into sandwiches. So eventually they put up Jollibee, and throughout the years the company has also acquired other quick service restaurants in Chinese, pizza, etc. So until now, Jollibee Foods Corporation is actually an international company with over 3,000 restaurants throughout the world. And very much key to this growth is the Filipino people, because Jollibee is very much a Filipino brand. It's a much beloved brand in the Philippines, as I'm sure any Filipino you ask would know. So it's very built into the company, that sense of belonging to the community. So it really just makes sense to continue working with the communities that were really the root of the success of the company. So JFC has always been doing outreach programs from the start, but in 2004, this was formalized into the Jollibee Group Foundation. And in all of the programs that we do, there are two main, let's say, pillars that we follow. And the first is the concept of shared value, in that we go into programs that has, of course, it's addressing a social need, a need of the community, but also in a way that makes economic or whatever other sense for the company. And we believe in doing that for two things. First of all, it's able to harness the strengths of the company in the projects that we do. And secondly, if it's linked to what the company does, then there's a greater chance of sustainability of the program. And the second pillar that we work on is really about partnerships, in that we run a very lean staff at the foundation, but we run nationwide programs. And the reason we're able to do that is we work with partners on the ground, both national and local. And it's really, in terms of co-creating programs, it's not just our programs, it's the programs that we really co-implement with our partners. So with this, our major programs are founded on these principles, and they're all related, of course, because we're a food company, they're all related to food. So in the area of education, we work on a school feeding program for pupils in public schools. And it's community-based also, so it's the parents who prepare, it's the schools that organize, and the local partners are involved. The company is, uses its experience in food preparation. So for example, right now we're building kitchens that can produce hundreds of meals per day, every day, so that to be able to feed more pupils. And then in the area, in our business, of course, the company requires a lot of raw vegetables. So we also have a farmer entrepreneurship program wherein we buy directly from smallholder farmers. So this is really a strong example of shared value. The company does need raw, fresh materials, and of course, the farmers need a market to sell it to. So the foundation works with partners to enable the farmers to do that. And in the area of disaster response, we still focus on access to food. So in the immediate aftermath, we focus on the provision of hot meals. Our commissary developed this mix that you just add to rice and then egg, and then it's a congee mix. So because as we know, after a disaster, it's very hard to find food. And even our recovery programs are related to our flagship program. So we also do special school feeding and farmer livelihood recovery. So through all of these things, we work on those values, how to harness the expertise of the company, and at the same time, really strengthen the partnerships on the ground, so that even whether we're there, we build on what our local partners are doing, and if we're not there, they're still able to do it on their own.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paolo Borromeo. I'm here representing the Ayala Group. I'm a managing director of Ayala Corporation, which is the holding company for the Ayala Group. Maybe just a couple of things, if you'll allow me. One, I'll give an overview of our business, our portfolio, and what we do. And second, maybe share with you our philosophy as it relates to sustainable impact and social impact. And I love the words that Joanna, I love two things that Joanna said. One, I'm a big believer in Jollibee. I'm a great fan. And two, the concept of shared value is something that we ascribe to very closely at the Ayala Group. We're big believers in what Michael Porter and their team are trying to convey. So let me start off with Ayala Group. So we are, I guess for those of you who know us, we are a 182-year-old business house. I think the oldest in the Philippines. Trace our roots back during the Spanish era, through the American times, the Japanese, and then eventually through Philippine independence. I think we are today in our 7th or 8th generation of leadership. So it says a lot about, I guess, the longevity and the lasting impact of the group. And one of the key pillars to our success has been our close affinity to the Philippine economic agenda. So we try to tie ourselves very closely to the national blueprint, if you will. We try to say we're apolitical, so no political questions, please. But we try to work with each government and each administration to further the developmental goals of the Philippines. So on that note, key word for us over the years, over the centuries, has been reinvention. We started off in all sorts of different things: distilleries, agriculture, I think the first train tracks in the Philippines. Today, people know us mainly for our real estate business. So we are one of the largest property developers in Manila and in the Philippines. But more than that, we've diversified. We own the oldest bank in the Philippines, BPI. We're into telco, Globe Telecom, partnership with Singtel. Manila Water, more recently in the late 90s, was the first PPP, public-private partnership in the Philippines, that we've since built on. And actually, Manila Water is a vehicle that we're now using to expand outside of the Philippines and into Southeast Asia. More recently, we started focusing more into what we call new or growth businesses, and there are 3 clusters. One is what we call a hard infrastructure, or power and transport. So power plants, transport infrastructure. So we got back into railroads in partnership with the Metro Pacific Group. We started getting to toll roads as well, and then other sorts of transport infrastructure and power infrastructure related businesses. The second focus area we started, investing more heavily on is what we call manufacturing, automotive and manufacturing. No? So we're trying to build on the Philippines as a hub for the region, not just for a variety of parts and pieces across the automotive value chain. So we have a couple of assets there today that we're trying to build up on and bulk up on, and hopefully we become a major player. We realize that manufacturing is a big job generator. In fact, we have a small company called IMI, which is an integrated microelectronics. It's tiny. It's maybe $200 million market cap. But amongst that, we have 50,000 employees in the Ayala Group, and 15,000 of those come from tiny IMI. No, so the job generating capacity of a manufacturing portfolio is tremendous. That's the second focus area. And then the third focus area is what we call social infrastructure, which is where we're making new investments in healthcare and in education. So I'll talk more about those in a minute. But just very quickly, our philosophy or our at least approach to social development and social impact. I think over the last few years, we've really evolved our thinking. First of all, I guess back in the day, philanthropy was really for big conglomerates was the big thing. No, we started Ayala Foundation 55 years ago. 55 years ago now, so it's one of the first foundations, and it's still our major philanthropic arm. Ayala Foundation has 3 or 4 major programs. Education is one of them, youth development is another, sustainable livelihood, and then arts and culture is a particular belief that we try to uphold. And that continues, that work today continues. We partner with different groups in the Philippines, with the government, with various NGOs to try to push those different programs. But more than just, I guess, philanthropy, over the last few years, well, we've moved. No, I think from philanthropy, you saw a phase where people were talking a lot about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and trying to, even within, for instance, with Globe Telecom doing something for the community, Manila Water doing something for their communities. And we went through that phase as well. And I think I just wanted to reiterate what Joanna said. I think at this, we're slowly evolving our thinking as well, more than just philanthropy and more than just corporate social responsibility, moving to this real concept of shared value, where more than just doling out or donating or funding social initiatives, you really try to embed it in your core business. And that's something that we're really trying to push. And I'll give you maybe a couple of examples of how we're doing it, both in our core business and our newer businesses. For instance, in our core businesses, Ayala Land, I think people know us to be sort of a premium brand in the Philippines. But over the last decade or so, we've started expanding our portfolio of products to now cater to different income streams in the Philippines. So today you'll find 5 different residential products. There's the highest end, which we call Ayala Land Premier, which is still there, and that those are price points at $1 million and up. But remarkably and I guess fantastically, think of a conglomerate being able to come out with a product 5 rings down into what we call social housing already. And this is where you find products that are in the $10,000 range, that we do offer out in the market, not as a dole out, but as a sustainable business in and of itself. So that's one example how we embed shared value into our day-to-day. The second is in our new businesses. So I mentioned manufacturing, but I'll focus a little bit on healthcare and education. To us, those 2 businesses, tremendous impact. And I'll talk more about it later. But to us, again, these are businesses that our country greatly needs. Education, you'll be surprised at the numbers. I think, we all know that the quality and the access to good education in the Philippines is not there, not at par relative to Singapore, Hong Kong, or Malaysia. I think the latest stat I saw was out of 3 million kids that go into grade 1, first grade, only 10% eventually graduate from college. So throughout the system, so many people fall through or fall out. On the healthcare side, similarly, we saw a big need. We realized that fundamental issues in access, affordability, basic quality. 6 out of 10 people, Filipinos, who succumb to illness and eventually die without seeing a doctor. 6 out of 10. No. It's terrible. Only 40% of barangays have access to a qualified health clinic in the Philippines. So it's a terrible situation. Affordability, our drugs are 30 times more expensive than India or Pakistan. So there's great need, no? And where we see great need, we try to deploy private capital. And that's what we're doing in healthcare and education. I'm happy to talk more about that later, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Esther Santos. I'm the president of PLDT Smart Foundation. PLDT Smart is a telecommunications company. It's one of the two bigger ones in the Philippines. The other one is Globe. So, but even if we're competitors, we're actually partners in many other businesses and in CSR. So PLDT Smart is part of the First Pacific group of companies, which is based here in Hong Kong. In fact, we're celebrating our 35th anniversary on Wednesday. That's why we're also here. I'm here. And so First Pacific investments are in the Philippines and in Indonesia. So we do have some sharing of experiences and expertise between the two countries. So also like Ayala, our group, which is in the Philippines, is headed by Manny Pangilinan. So we do adopt a lot of the investment thinking of Mr. Pangilinan, also in our CSR. And so he thinks a lot in terms of long-term sustainability and scale, and also a return to investment. So we try to adopt that in the businesses we have, and also in our philanthropic efforts. So First Pacific invests in businesses with a strong component for social good. So we can see this in the portfolio we currently have. It's a little bit similar to Ayala because our two leaders have that nation-building intention very much top of mind. So we are into the utilities. So aside from telecommunications, we're also into power distribution and generation. Water distribution, Maynilad, the other company aside from Manila Water. And we also have hospitals. We have invested in hospitals, but not in the same way as Ayala, where they put up their own. I think that's Quali Medcare. What we do is invest in existing private hospitals, and we try to improve the management of those hospitals so that they can reach a wider group of the population. Also, we have infrastructure like roads and mass transit. And we also have a media company, which is the TV5, which is part of the PLDT group in a way, because we are trying to integrate the media, telecommunications and media. So in our foundation, for PLDT Smart Foundation, we're actually like 21 years old and turning 22 this year. It started as the foundation, philanthropic arm of the PLDT, which has been in the Philippines for many, many years. And when they acquired Smart, which is the mobile telephone company, that's where we kind of grew faster with the technology. So in our foundation, in all our foundations actually, in all our CSR, we also follow the dictum of creating shared value and alignment with our core business. So most of our CSR would actually be a reflection of our core business. So for us in PLDT Smart Foundation, our tagline or our motto is a connected, empowered, progressive Philippines. So we use the power of telecommunications and connection for what I would say 3 areas that are more or less the key enablers: education, entrepreneurship, or social enterprise. We try to also start some social enterprises. And also for us to contribute to our long-term sustainability for the company in terms of human resources, we do a lot of promotion or investment in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, because we would need these young people to go into these courses so that we can hire them later on. Right now, the Philippines is not yet maybe in the level of Singapore or China for STEM, but we have been trying to do our share to increase this. And so their alignment with core business, and we also do among our companies, we do work together a lot. Not like it's like our small CSR group. We have a CSR council, so we share our programs. We coordinate very closely so that we are able to maximize our collective impact.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Rico Gonzalez. I'm the Managing Director of Exchange. On this panel, Exchange is the youngest and the smallest institution. We're a startup. We set up in 2011. We're a tiny organization. All we do is incubate social enterprises. We do that from a philanthropic perspective. We are set up as a for-profit, but we are not ever going to pay out a dividend from what we do. So our funders don't get anything back. We look at ourselves primarily as ecosystem builders. We hope eventually to see a thriving ecosystem of social enterprises in the Philippines. To do that, you have to build up the enterprises themselves, which at the moment are very tiny. A lot of the social impact we want to see in the country, we do not believe is achievable unless there are organizations on the ground that can bring multiple parties together. And usually, those organizations have to be set up around entrepreneurs, around people who are dedicated to a particular vision and who are willing to set up organizations that will last beyond them, addressing these problems. And so that is where we have found ourselves. We are now incubating social enterprises. We originally, because I'm also the founder of this little startup, originally we were hoping to be a passive impact investor. What I really wanted to do was hand over some money and say, report back to me in 6 months and then we'll see what's going on. And then I could go on and do other things. It became immediately apparent to us sometime around 2009, 2010, that wasn't going to happen. The organizations we were looking at, our pipeline, if you want to call it that, was non-existent. What we had, though, were fledgling organizations that had promise, but were far from being financially secure, and who are today still at risk. Since our founding in 2011, we have assisted 11 organizations. One has just shuttered, so it's defunct, it's closed shop. That's not a bad track record in 5 years, but quite a lot of them, the jury's still out. So it could get pear-shaped from here quite easily. We have 2 of the 11 that have broken even. We are now trying to determine whether that break-even status can be repeated on an annual basis, because that could very easily reverse also. And we have one, as we speak, that is on the brink, that may not last the next 2.5 months. The others are somewhere in between risk-wise. If you're looking at risk of failure, they are somewhere in between complete disaster to promise. A lot of them are working according to an expected plan. I can say that there are no nasty surprises in a lot of these at the moment, but the definition of a surprise is that you don't see it coming. So I will defer judgment on the portfolio until all of it pans out. We are Philippine-focused, and because of a combination of what the country needs and what opportunities there are, we tend to be very diversified. We do not invest in a single sector or a single industry. One, because there aren't multiple opportunities in a single industry. because it's such a small market. But also because we need to diversify our portfolio. We can't run the risk of being taken under by the failure of a single industry. So we work with people who are in education, we work with people who are in clean energy, we work with people who are initiating anti-poverty structures. So it's really a very, very broad range. The one thing they have in common is that they operate in the Philippines, and it's a market we know well, and where our interventions are very productive. So we do everything from funding, and that's from grants to hybrids. We have very intensive mentoring interventions. We second executives into these organizations where necessary on our dime. We provide accounting, finance, oversight where it's necessary. Basically anything and everything that a startup may require, for as long as it's something that we are able to provide. And part of the decision about whether we're going to incubate a particular enterprise or not relies on our assessment of whether we can intervene or not. So we tend not to work with social enterprises that we do not think will scale, not because they are not social enterprises, but because we're irrelevant to a social enterprise that's happy to be small. All we will do is create headaches because we'll be pushing them to get big. If they don't want to get big, then we're wasted. So we tend to focus on things that we think will scale. Of course, as in all of this, we could be completely wrong. And so part of our approach is we're always mindful of the fact that we're experimenting. The entrepreneurs we work with know that we're experimenting. They understand that they're experimenting, and a lot of the challenge is how do you maximize the impact of resource in the experimentation. The hope is that in the end, we end up with enterprises that have longevity, and this is the benchmark for us, maximizing social impact over time. So a lot of our investees will go through a period, the moment they engage with us, where their impact measures will flatline, and that's intentional, because we focus on building the institutions, not building the beneficiary count. Our bet is that over time, the beneficiary count spikes because we've built the institution properly. So that's who we are.
Thank you very much for the introduction. You see, we have a lot of experience represented on the panel, as well as an innovator and early mover in venture philanthropy. And one of the themes for the conference is how has social investing impacted Asia. Clearly, over a number of years, the large corporations in the Philippines have invested and sought to build up nation building or infrastructure themselves. That's possibly a contrast to what we heard this morning in Hong Kong, where the corporations have maybe been standing back and less involved across the whole of what they could contribute to society. I'll ask a few questions here amongst the panel. Definitely want to involve the audience, so think of some questions, and I'll come to you a little bit later on. One of the things I wanted to ask about, because a theme of the conference is also collaboration. So there's a very strong civil society in the Philippines. I think we've read and heard about that recently. But as civil society develops, people want to become more enterprising. How do you work among other stakeholders? So how would you work with government more? How have you worked with them in the past? Is there a good and positive relationship for scaling up your work or then partnering with government? Maybe Esther, I'll ask you first. Thank you. Each panelist.
All of us, since we're foundations, we do work closely with government and other NGOs. We're all, like us, our foundation is also a member of a bigger association for corporate foundations called the League of Corporate Foundations, where Jollibee and Ayala are also members. And there's also the Philippine Business for Social Progress, which are the member companies it's composed of the companies as members. And so there's a lot of collaboration, really, I guess, with many years of we do have a strong civil society. And we have been collaborative. So I think we know from experience that our reach as a foundation can also be just limited. So what we've been doing, for instance, is like Paula said, government agencies like the Department of Education to find out their priorities, and that's where we align our investments. Like if it's a lack of classrooms or a lack of teachers, we do have scholarships for teachers. We do build classrooms, especially in disaster areas. But one experience that I would say as a best practice for us in PLDT Smart Foundation, which was partly collaborative and also in our foundation as a telecommunications company, where we want to make impact is on education, for instance. We do work a lot with subject matter experts. We don't see ourselves as the expert in education, but we use telecommunications, internet to strengthen education system. But one of the best practices we had, or one of the more successful projects we had, was precisely working with subject matter experts. These were two professors, physics professors in the Philippines, and they developed a methodology of teaching which was precisely addressing the problem of the Philippines educational system, which is lack of classroom, lack of teachers, lack of materials, everything lacking. So in fact, that's where we mostly work, I think, we're in education. But this couple, they're Ramon Magsaysay awardees. We discovered them because of that. They have a small school in Bohol, and they were like working with a typical sample poor school with students really failing. In fact, in their first year when they came back from the States, they were abroad working, and they were Dr. Bernido, Christopher Bernido, his mother owned that school in Bohol, in a small island, really, very small island, sleepy coastal town in Bohol. So no one can even reach, like most of their students don't even get to the University of the Philippines, which is the biggest public university. But it has a high, it's hard to enter UP. So when they saw that, they applied scientific thinking, and that's where they did everything. They studied the behavior of the students. They applied neuroscience, everything they knew. And with more than 10 years of application of that methodology, we scaled it up into more than 1,000 schools, with more than 1,000 schools now practicing it. Even the bigger universities, like University of the East, are practicing this methodology. So it's a small investment in terms of financial investment, but the scale and the impact has been very great. You can see now the performance of the students really almost 100%. Really, they don't leave anyone behind. If before they were failing, students really brought up the achievements of the achievement scores of the students. So we don't own the methodology. We're just empowering the couple who had that methodology. We provided the information website for them, and then we sponsor their conferences so that more schools can apply the methodology. So that's, I think, one very good example for us of collaboration.
Thank you. Paula?
Maybe just a couple of things to add. One, I think there's a natural tension between business and government, especially as it relates to social needs, right? So that's why business comes up with philanthropic foundational work, is to try to I guess meet needs that government's not able to address. But I actually think that you cannot do things without government support, no. And in fact, it's not business trying to supplant government, but it's business trying to complement government. So in a variety of the things that we do, you have to have government. So whether it's the Department of Health or the Department of Education, I'm sure everyone works with them very closely. The second thing I just wanted to highlight was, at least for us at the Ayala Foundation, one of the things that we were able, or one of the things that we did last year was a tri-sector collaboration partnership with SMU, with Singapore Management University. And I guess the spirit of it is exactly what you said, around trying to enhance collaboration opportunities across sectors. So whether it's government, society, general society, and also the business side. And it's a program that we're very excited with. It's a scholarship program to SMU's tri-sector collaboration. In fact, one of our 3 new scholars is from IRRI, the International Research institute. So, but I guess it just underscores the importance in partnership across various sectors.
Over the years of working with partners, we've sort of developed like a partnership cycle that we go through, and this is basically how we decide who to partner with. So that goes for both government and non-government, whatever type of institution. So the first step there, I would say, is very critical, and that's the getting to know you part. So that's really where we, because there may be some similarities, but our goals really similar enough, compatible enough, and what do they have in their experience, what do we have in our experience, and do we really think that we can work together? And it's only, we've discovered that you really need to go through that so that you more or less have an idea whether you can do something together in the future. And it's only after that that we formalize the partnership, and then of course you do the program, and then after that we do the evaluation. Did the program do what we expected it to do? How can it be better? Or is it time to move on to something else? And if it's something to be continued, then we renew that. So that's how we go through it for all of our partners in terms of collaboration. For government, we work also a lot with local governments because we want to work in farther areas, and there's really a lot that local government can do in terms of education, in terms of agriculture, in the areas that we work with. But at the same time, in order for us to choose which areas to go through, then, as I said, we really have to get familiar first with who we're working with.
You're responsible at the moment, I think, for the Farmers Entrepreneurship Programme. Is there an example there of how you've benefited or worked with government? And that covers a large area, so do you interact with many local governments to progress that?
Yeah, if in the case of the Farmer Entrepreneurship Program, for example, for one of our pilot sites that's in Nueva Ecija in Central Philippines. So the program itself, the components there, because of the partners, of course, we provide a market that the farmers sell to. And the farmers themselves, they know how to plant. But it's in the getting from the farm to the market, that's a very big area where a lot of people can work on. So, for example, the local government, they provide some technical support, technical linkage, like even linkage to the seed companies, what seed to use, because they also have their own agriculture technician. And even in terms of, helping the farmers to file their paperwork, because they have to organize themselves into a legal entity. And this is not something people in the rural areas, they're really not familiar doing with that. So there's a lot that government can do as long as they're willing to go into the program to do it.
Thanks. Rico, the question on collaboration with government may be a long way from what you see every day. I was in the Philippines in February for an ADB organized event that talked a lot about inclusive business, and also seemed to say that the government in the Philippines is very much behind giving some sort of priority or progress, possibly more than other countries, in fact. How about in your own experience, and is inclusive business happening on the ground in the Philippines?
There's definitely a lot of interest, but it'll take a while before we actually see it happen, right? Because quite a bit of structures, a number of structures need to be set up, and they're not necessarily physical structures, they're institutional structures that are non-existent. But we have to start somewhere, right? As far as collaboration with government and actually collaboration across the board is concerned, the one interesting case study is that we have is Hapinoy, which was our first investee, and interestingly enough was the social enterprise founded by our absent Senator Bam, right? They started out with a model that was a base of the pyramid retail network. And they wanted to augment the incomes of poor women by scaling the operations of these small mom and pop stores. Combined purchasing, combined distribution, all of that. When we first intervened, they were doing this already, not profitable. They were at their 12th iteration of the business model. And the moment we came in, we realized they were spending too much for the training of the women, and that they would never break even if they kept doing this. So one of the things we helped them do was to adopt a hybrid structure. And that hybrid structure has unlocked a significant amount of collaboration with corporate CSR. Because now we're able to train women at scale using CSR money that Happy itself doesn't have. Happy has the expertise, has the team on the ground, but does not have the funding to go to all the women wherever they are. But corporations have that reach, they have that funding. And the collaborations with corporations has allowed us to train more women than we ever thought Happy on its own would ever be able to do. So that's been a massive win. But that was only part of the model. The other part of the model was distribution, and we couldn't figure out how to do distribution. Distribution in the Philippines is very difficult because you're talking about 7,100 islands, and distribution has an operating margin of about 1-2%. A social enterprise trying to do distribution is committing suicide in the Philippines. And so one of the other things we did after we figured out training and the division into a hybrid model was to get into the unthinkable, which was to get the largest independent distributor in the country to actually invest in Happy and open up his network of warehouses and delivery trucks, which we were able to do. So one of the largest investors in Happy now is a commercial enterprise.
How did you persuade them? What was it that changed their mind or said, no, this is the right way, a better way to do things?
He was very social to begin with, but he was worried about the Sari Sari store infrastructure because that was his main market. And he was being invaded by an expansion of low-end convenience stores. So he needed to protect that market anyway. And so all we needed to do was to tap into the fact that our interests were aligned to allow this to happen. And because you have somebody who's very social to begin with, it happened. In fact, he couldn't justify an investment in Happy commercially, so he did it from his foundation. But by doing that, he opened up the network, the distribution network, and we learned a lot. Happy was trying to figure this model out for 3 years prior to our arrival. When we opened the tap, we learned what we needed to learn in 5 months. And in 5 months, we discovered that it would never work. Definitively. And so we needed to pivot. And that pivot has taken us to mobile commerce because that was the linchpin. We could deliver in Happy but we couldn't charge. We couldn't terminate transactions because the women were only operating with cash. And trying to manage cash across a huge network required margins that you could only achieve if you were a microfinance company, not a distributor. So we had to figure that out. So now we're working with mobile money. Our first interactions with government were basically trying to get the taxman to give our nanays a break. Because we had nanays who were starting to show some success, and before they could even scale, the tax people were already trying to take their tax cut. Small enterprises in the Philippines don't pay tax by law. That was our first, in Happy our first interaction with government. Now, we're working with the central bank because we need to get good at know your client processes. We need to be able to manage financial transactions at the sari-sari store level. And that means very, very close interaction with government. Our bet is that once we're able to terminate financial transactions, we're going to be able to do distribution of goods and services. And that is when the model starts to click, right? So Happy was one of our first break-even companies. It broke even last year. And that break-even point doesn't mean that we sustain from here. It means now we have the opportunity to pivot to something that could have massive impact for the country. So it's very, very exciting. And none of it possible without CSR money, without government, without private business. But you need the Hapinoy institution in the middle to bring it all together. Or else everybody's willing, but there's no vehicle. The vehicle needs to get born, it needs to survive, and it needs to build itself into a survivable model.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I will ask for questions from the audience. Well, a question in two parts. I mentioned inclusive business, and a couple of you nodded. If you could say if it means anything in terms of what you've been doing, or there's a real change. But Paolo, you were active, mentioned healthcare. Maybe you could give a couple of examples of what you're doing in healthcare, and what you do differently through the business side as opposed to the foundation as well, just to compare the two. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So healthcare, I guess, firstly, is not a pillar in our foundation. So it's not something that we look at through the Ayala Foundation. But it's an interesting case study, especially, I love what Rico said, no, but there are comparisons that we can draw. So naturally, we're a big company trying to get into social or impact investing ourselves. I'll give maybe two examples that hopefully the audience can tease out some learnings from. But it's a fantastic case study on how a large conglomerate like ours, or like us, it's a departure from our traditional way of doing things. Like Temasek, like GIC, like Jardines, what we like to do is to buy big companies, right? Do the mega merger, do the big M&A. But healthcare to us was a radical departure, and I'll give two examples. The first is last year we acquired the smallest acquisition I think we've ever done, which is an acquisition of Generica, which is the third largest pharmacy chain in the Philippines. Probably less than $10 million acquisition, and we're used to hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a radical departure for us because it's a recognition, A, that healthcare is important, B, that there are social entrepreneurs like Generica, the founders of which were ex-Ayala executives actually, but that big companies like us could invest in social entrepreneurs like Generica, and then find ways to scale them up. No? So this year, I think last year when we bought them, they had 500 stores. This year, we're already at 600 stores. There's a lot of synergies that a big company like us can bring to the table, whether it's retail space, whether it's franchising loans from our bank to the various pharmacy franchisees, whether it's access to large businesses or organizations where you can sell pharmaceutical products, whether it's through joint co-education and awareness campaigns to make people understand the benefits of generic medication more and more. But it's a fantastic case study on how a big company like us decided, hey, we can help, we can invest in a social entrepreneur and be a social entrepreneur ourselves. And hopefully be able to scale that business. But I think what Rico mentioned earlier, it's such an important thing though, that the organization, whether you're a startup, a social entrepreneur, or a funder, that you're able to find a business that's able to scale up. Now, I think that's key. And I think it's also key that the business or the initiative in question is actually addressing a clear societal need. No, so it's not just coming up with something cool just for the sake of it. There's actually something that you need to address. In Generica's case, it was the problem of expensive medicine that was hard to find, especially for the low-income population in the Philippines. And we love that. No, as a group of, as a business house, we love that, and we said, we can help build that up. I guess the second case study is again in healthcare, Simon. You talk about inclusivity. Another example is, again, it's a radical departure. It's a business house starting up something from the ground up completely. And there were a lot of anxious, uncomfortable moments in my boardroom. I remember when we were presenting this case for change. But we said, we bought Generica. There's one more initiative that we'd like to do in healthcare. And that was to start up a chain of retail primary care clinics in the Philippines, which is unheard of in Manila. In Manila, in the Philippines, you have mom and shop doctors' clinics and maternity clinics in different barangays. The need we were trying to address was, again, the accessibility issues, especially of communities, to get quality primary care. It's not even secondary or tertiary. It's real primary care, consultation for the basic illnesses, typically cough and cold, flu vaccination, things like that. So we borrowed pieces from models in Indonesia, in India, in the US, and tried to Philippinize it, if that's such a word. Think of a 100 square meter strip mall or strip mall store, where we put in a convenience store aspect, you put in a pharmacy, you put in 2 doctor consultation rooms, you put in an X-ray, which our partners from GE were able to give us at fantastically low prices, and you have a retail primary clinic. And to us, it addresses, again, those needs. And the challenge for us as a big company is how do you scale that, and how do you make it sustainable?
Does that have an independent management and leadership now who will take that forward?
It's a great question. Yes, absolutely. You have to have a unique management team to run it. So it's by itself, Simon, because you have to. And you have to give it the right measures and the right accountability so you're able to track success. And more importantly, it's learning and not being afraid to revector and to pivot when you need to. Because, for instance, we piloted 2 clinics and we realized that our costs were too high. We were spending about 800,000 pesos a month. It's not enough in terms of, it's too much in terms of, you get a lot of people coming in, but of course you can't charge them too much, no? And so part of, I guess, the learning that we need to do, that I'm sure all of us at one point or another are doing, is how you revector and create a business model that addresses a particular need, but in a sustainable, financially sustainable way, because that's the only way you can survive.
Thank you. Any comments, Joanna or Esther, on inclusive business or in response to Paula?
Comment. We have a different approach to healthcare. Although we do own hospitals, what we see where we can really reach scale, actually for any scale, is government. So what we have done with our hospital foundations was to focus on government hospitals and military hospitals. So that's the subject of our corporate social responsibility, mainly helping them in the management side of the hospital. And we've had some good experiences because of that. We've retrained a lot of the hospital management of the military hospitals and a public hospital in Pasig. And we have started to see the fruits because they've started to see their scale. So how they order the equipment, the medicines. So we're seeing a more transparent methodology borrowed from the private sector and is now applied to the government. So we're hoping that will also, well, it is already impacting on healthcare, especially for those, the marginalized, those that cannot go to the private hospitals.
Talking about inclusive business, it could be in one form, such as the provision of goods in a way that's affordable to the marginalized. So there's been talk about healthcare, and that's one way. And the other side of inclusive business is including the marginalized in the supply chain as suppliers or such, whatever, of the company. And that's ideally, of course, how you achieve inclusive growth. And as the companies grow, then these business partners grow as well. And it sounds very nice, but in actuality, when that applies that, so let me give an example for the farmers. Let's say you're a food company like us, and then if you're dealing with a regular supplier, just a normal business supplier, you just tell them, okay, so you log on to the online portal and you make your bid, and then we'll let you know who wins the bid for the product that we're going to buy. So if you can imagine trying to do that with the farmer group, that of course they barely know any computers, they don't know what an online portal is, make a bid, etc. So when you say inclusive business, it does not mean business as usual. It means that the business itself also has to make adjustments if it's really willing to be more inclusive. So each organization will have its own way of going about it. There are many different ways, but in our case, that's where the foundation comes in. So similar to what Rico said, we see ourselves as an enabling the institution. In this case, it's the farmers' organization. So building their capacity, training them in business planning, understanding the business, and yes, training them to learn the computer and the internet and log in, because unless they're able to compete with the other suppliers, then it won't be sustainable. And at the same time, also helping them to realize that they have their own strength. Their strengths being that they have direct access to their produce because they're the ones who produce it, so they can deliver it faster, they can deliver it fresher. So talking about inclusive business, it really has to be more than just a token saying that, oh, we want to do this. It's really understanding what will it take to be inclusive.
I think, yes.
Actually, just on that point that Joanna raised, I think inclusivity has three aspects, all of which we've mentioned already. One is the ability to come up with new products, new services, new investments that cater to the marginalized or low-income segment of society. The second, which Joanna rightly points out, is inclusivity in the value chain. So making sure that every step of your value chain, you're able to tap into suppliers, farmers, logistics, distributors, and are able to bring them into the whole concept of the value chain that you're creating. I think the third is inclusivity in terms of the community itself that you impact. And for us, for instance, in the real estate development, there's a couple of examples where you can't just come into a community and start building and marginalizing the existing community that's there. So I think for us that's huge. I mean, we do that, for instance, in El Nido, in one of our resort areas, where yes, we develop the islands for tourism, but you also teach the community and employ the community and uplift the community to be able to contribute to your development. So I think that's the third aspect of inclusivity that we can't leave behind.
I think the companies that recognize they need to change and adapt and do things differently is the way to make it more inclusive, particularly on the supply chain side. Who has some questions? Hopefully we have a few questions, and I'd like you to come up to the microphone and say who you are, and we'll probably take the questions two at a time, and the panelists can decide which one to respond to, and do direct your question if you want, otherwise we'll let the panel choose. Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you for your sharing today. My name is David, and I teach at the University of Hong Kong. And you've been talking a lot about inclusion and collaboration and whatnot, primarily from the aspect of businesses and operations that are within the Philippines nationally. And obviously, because a lot of us are not from there specifically, but a lot of the programs that we're involved in do involve the Philippines, I wanted to talk about collaboration and inclusion and all these different things that would include cross-border type of collaboration. So just very quickly to kind of explain where I'm coming from. So at HKU, what I do is I take really complicated problems, and then my students and I try to come up with cool business solutions for those things. And so we've created 3 companies that are very Philippine-centric. And so one in particular that's done relatively well over the past year is called the Fair Family is what we call it, but the Fair Employment Agency, where we're trying to create an ethical path of migration for migrant workers from the Philippines and elsewhere as they go overseas, like to a place like Hong Kong, to be domestic workers or other things, right? And so as part of that whole supply chain of people, for lack of a better term, we're also creating a training center in the Philippines. And so the idea is to make sure that anyone who is going to be an OFW from the Philippines, regardless of where they go, they can have ethical, relatively inexpensive training that's good for them, teaches them about finance and law, et cetera, and then they go and hopefully are able to remit money back and come back as quickly as they can. So my question then is, as someone from the outside looking in who's been setting up these businesses and trying to collaborate, it can be very difficult, right? Whether politically or legally or just establishing those connections and those partnerships. So, for example, some of the things you've provided, over 7,000 islands, right? For a training center or a similar type of business, how does the communication get out to explain to people that it exists? Or from a kind of problem perspective, the people that we facilitate or that we work with are OFWs who are, from our perspective, significantly taken advantage of, but from the Philippines government and people perspective, they're actually in a better situation than many others, and so therefore they don't warrant the same amount of attention or help, which is totally understandable. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, for those of us that are on the outside looking in that are establishing or trying to set up programs, what are some suggestions that you have for the same type of inclusiveness or collaboration, but maybe looking slightly outside the borders of the Philippines?
Okay, thank you. Is there another quick question just to think about? There's a second question, or should we answer that one first? Okay, we'll work on that one. Come up with a new question. Who wants to answer that as to how you could facilitate interactions between the Philippines and overseas?
I'm afraid a quick answer is with much difficulty.
I can give you my card.
One of the social enterprises we're incubating is Bagosphere. It is based out of Singapore and does training in one of the smaller islands of the country, in Negros. And it's gained traction. It's doing well. What they do is it's a study now, pay later program. It's a 2-month intervention, after which, okay, step back. Before the 2-month intervention, these are rural out-of-school youth who typically will maybe get 3,000 pesos as a waiter or a busboy in one of the nearby big cities. What Bagosphere does is it trains for 2 months and gets them employed in the call center industry. And the financial impact is almost immediate. Once they get employed, Bagosphere has a hiring rate of about 80% of all of the graduates. The typical government-funded program has a 30% success rate, just to put that in perspective. Nice to have the attention to detail of a Singaporean manager. But the impact is almost immediately tangible. They go from a 3,000 peso a month potential income to a 9,000 peso a month starting salary. The net difference of which is sufficient to pay for the tuition on a deferred basis for the next year. And after that, the income stream is theirs. And so the impact, typically they become the primary breadwinner for their family. And this is an initiative that comes out of Singapore, collaborating with a small town in the Philippines. How did it come about? Because the founders, 3 Singaporeans, had been sent to this little island by NUS for exposure. And they got to the island and they said, this can't be. We have to do something about it, and they did. I say the story because the difficult part of the collaboration arises from identifying the connection points. And typically that only happens when somebody comes to actually physically identify where those connection points might be. In their case, they happened upon it. For us who are deliberately setting up institutions, that has to be part of the process. We're very open to it. We've, over the years, had conversations off and on, talking to people who are exploring business models in other countries, trying to see whether there is a way to build networks of franchised businesses or basically just sharing known technology or known initiatives that have worked in other countries to within the Philippines or vice versa. Bagosphere eventually has ambitions of being able to offer the model across the region. Exactly how we would do that, we have no idea today. So we would, if we're successful here, we're going to end up in the same situation you're grappling with now. Coming in, I was talking to some guys who are incubating enterprises in Cambodia and Thailand, and we've been having this conversation for 2 years now, trying to figure out whether it's possible to do shared services across Southeast Asia for startups. Because there are certain commonalities across our markets that may be scalable and may be hubbable, if that's a word you'll allow me to coin, so that we don't end up experimenting separately, disjointedly across these markets. But the reality at the moment is that we only discover the connections because we bump into each other. And there is no easy way to locate them. These are all opportunities, and I guess you'd call it friction. It's market friction. The market friction is immense. There's just no built infrastructure to do this, and so it's one of the things that AVPN is good for.
Very much so. So we hope to encourage people to have more conversations as well and share where they can with the Philippines. Any of your experience in terms of trying to solve the same problems that probably exist every day in what you do?
I'll just add to what Rico said for Hong Kong. No? Since PLDT has an office here in Hong Kong, and First Pacific is also based here in Hong Kong, you can also try to reach out to us. Another way is we have similarly incubator, or startup incubator, which is called Idea Space. It's mainly technopreneurship. So if you have a technology that can be techno-entrepreneurship, a techno-enterprise, technology-based enterprise that can be started, scaled, and later on, you can go through that, because we're also willing to look into social enterprises as long as there's some form of technology involved. So that's probably something very close to us, because one of our biggest clients are actually the overseas Filipino workers, the same for both of us. So anything to help them also in a sustainable way, we would be willing to look at it.
Okay. Right. Questions. Good. We have a few questions. Maybe Philo and the gentleman there, and then next round here and here. Thank you.
Hi, it's Philo Alto. I'm based in Hong Kong, philanthropy advisor, and I'm from the Philippines. I grew up there, and Hong Kong is home already. A few things. First of all, AVPN has been around for 4 years already, and it's the first time that the Philippines is having a contingent here, which is actually great.
Fantastic. That's fantastic.
So that's actually quite good. And two points I would like to mention. Number one is Rico's point on the connectivity actually being in the Philippines, so to actually know what's going on, what can be done. So in relation to that, you're here in Hong Kong, you spend time to travel, just 2 hours, not too far, not too close. What's your call to action to the participants here in AVPN, who are a lot of them from Asia and also globally as well? Because part of it is really what is the people are looking into the Philippines. Not many people are aware that the Philippines is the best performing economy this quarter, 6.2% GDP growth across Asia, and global is also doing pretty well as well. But how can or how should international players look at that? That's number one. Number two is in terms of idea space. In fact, when Earl was one of my speakers here in Hong Kong, it's part of it to actually get the cross country collaboration, so that the people outside of Hong Kong knows about what's going on in the Philippines, and also the potential that actually could happen there. So that's bringing the connectivity. So would be interested in your views as to what resources, philanthropic resources, venture philanthropy resources, corporate CSR resources that you think you'd like us to learn more about and exchange cards with yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I take your question as well, and then maybe two on the panel can answer that question from Philo? Thank you. Your name, please?
Hi, my name is Ratish. I'm a co-founder of a consulting organization called Sattva. We are based out of India, and one of our core focus of interest is both inclusive businesses, with whom we work hand in hand, but also to explore opportunities where corporations have engaged with social enterprises constructively as part of their core business. So there were a lot of interesting case studies. My questions to Mr. Paolo from the Ayala Group. Two questions, really. One is your move into healthcare and your choice of partners as a social enterprise is very fascinating. Just wanted to understand from you, what were some of the business and social indicators that you had in mind before you made the choice of the partner? Like, why them as opposed to somebody else? You did mention they were ex-executives of your group. Other than that, if there were other things that you had in mind. And two is, as someone who's running a mainstream business and also this, your expectations of business outcomes. What is the horizon that you look at when you see that they will, or is it the same parameter that you look at in terms of the kind of performance both of them will deliver? Would love to hear your thoughts on both of these questions.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take maybe Philo's question about what should the call to action be or requests from other people? Sorry, did you?
I have a question that's related to Philo's. So
Okay, add yours on to Philo's quickly. We are in our last 10 minutes, so we can speed up and have more questions or comments, but go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ariane Hassani, JP Morgan Global Philanthropy. So I wanted to actually follow up on what Philo said. We are supporting IdeaSpace, and we are also supporting the Grameen Foundation working with Hapinoi in the Visayas region to build out a last mile agent network. So the next thing we're looking at now in the Philippines actually is the divide between industry and what the educational sector is actually offering it as far as human capital is concerned. We're finding that industry is actually seeing the human capital coming out of the educational system and saying the curriculum is outdated. By the time everybody graduates, we need to do our part in upskilling and training everybody who's graduating, and these degrees and certificates don't mean anything to us anymore. That's kind of the echo that we've been getting. I'd love to have your perspective, especially you, Esther, who's working in IT and in STEM, very fast evolving, technologically savvy people coming out of these educational institutions, both vocational and secondary, post-secondary. Love to get your input as to whether you think that's something that resonates with you and industry in general.
Okay, thank you. So, yep. Esther first, maybe responding to that, and also what else could AVPN or other people in the room do to help the connection?
Yeah, well, her question's still very fresh, and thank you very much for that. Because, yes, there's definitely a lot to be done in terms of education. We've seen it in that experience we had with the Bernido couple, the neurophysicist, the dynamic learning program. It's very effective impact. It has very strong impact. We've seen it in all the universities, the schools that have implemented them. Unfortunately, I really felt so bad when I realized that it's really just a small percentage that we're influencing, because the larger population is still run by the public school system, and we can't seem to change their curriculum or change their methodology to something more effective. So until we do something, so it's good Carl is here from government, so we really have to have the collaborative effort, that they have to also be innovative in terms of because the methodology is precisely for STEM. Our experience is that the basics should be strong, so the fundamentals for the students, for physics, math, and all the other sciences have to be strong. So this methodology is precisely that. It enhances the skills for research. It's in the secondary level, high school. That's the most critical period, because that's what we learned. The children can play while they're in the elementary years, but the most effective change happens in high school. From there, university is too late. So we have to work on high school. So that's our first learning. And for STEM, it has to be there. The discipline is important, and innovation can come later. As for IdeaSpace and our call to action, basically we're trying to put the innovation in terms of in philanthropy in all that we do. Maybe what we need is patient money, because like all of us, we're just using CSR money to try to effect some change in the way we're doing things in the Philippines. But there's always been this fund that I wanted to create. So when I got invited to this AVPN, it already contains 2 of the letters that I need. Right. Because we want, well, our chairman is MVP, so I always have MVP in mind. So the Millionaires Venture for Philanthropy Fund. So if we can put up something like that together, and that, as Rizal, our hero, said, genius knows no country. So the ideas don't have to come from the Philippines, can come from anywhere in Asia. And we're very active in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because we're also part of that chair.
I think there's some very interesting things happening in India as well. So if you have the chance to meet with some of the Indian delegates who are here, so Central Square Foundation and others, they have tried to change things that are happening in the public school sector quite a lot. Okay, we have shorter time, but let's keep going.
Yeah, so the ask is somewhat nuanced. Has to do with funding. We've been meeting now with the conferences since when? 2011? Yeah.
2012.
Yeah. And from the time we started, I think we've encountered this problem where we have a mismatch between available funding and the opportunities on the ground. The people on the ground keep on saying there's no money. The people with the money keep on saying there is money, there are no opportunities on the ground. I think it's time we start deliberately talking about that gap. And that gap is a risk gap. It's a risk appetite gap. There are institutions on the ground, but they are not fully fledged, fully functional social enterprises that can deliver a financial return and a measurable social impact immediately. They are enterprises that need to get built up. They need capital to get built up. What we need is a certain pocket of funding that is willing to take the additional risk of building the institutions that will allow collective impact to happen. Unless that capital materializes, the institutions will not materialize. These institutions, at the moment, these institutions that are being born are making do with CSR money. But the metrics of CSR money are not appropriate for the build that is necessary on the ground. It is a high-risk build, and there are very few of us that are doing it. But if you're a philanthropic donor that will never see your money back, a zero return investment that builds an institution that can then deliver impact over time, I would argue has more strategic value than a grant. We have to select the institutions properly. We have to monitor them. We have to mentor them. We have to make sure that the build is happening. But the risk capital is absolutely essential.
Okay. We had a question relating to indicators and how you chose in healthcare.
Was it Latish? Maybe just two things. One, you mentioned about our choice of partners and what the business social indicators are. I think just very simply, maybe I'll boil it down to three things. One is shared vision, that you're aligned in terms of what you want to do with the business and what you see in the industry are the major gaps. Two is an alignment in terms of values, that you operate the same kind of way. And in this particular case, we were comforted because he spent 30 years with us, so he knew how we did business. And then the third, related to that, is the governance style as well. So as long as there's comfort in how you govern as a business owner, and that's aligned to our way of governance, then I think that creates an alignment and a potential for partnership. We've had many that, or a few at least, that have fallen through over time because one of the three were not in place. I think the second question was, how do we evaluate businesses, now especially on this of this kind? I'll say a few things. Number one, we were in a board meeting last week, and in terms of management time, we gave the same amount of time my board did to a $300 million energy project as we did to a $3 million healthcare request for funding. And so in terms of management time and resources and prioritization, it's fantastic to see. It's amazing to see how a big business house is able to look at those things in a similar way. It just tells you the level of priority and importance that we put into this. Having said that, there are differences. I think we expect returns not to be the same level of magnitude, but at the same time still above cost of capital. I think that's extremely important. So cost of capital today is 8%. You're looking at a return of 10, 12%. We're willing to go to that level of return. The second is time frame. I think we try to keep things within a 3 to 5 year horizon, or at least path to profitability in 3 to 5 years. But having said that, we do recognize that especially startups need time to revector, right? And so you allow them that time to revector, but at the same time, there's only so much revectoring that you can do, right, before you realize this isn't worth it. And then the last point is on scale. I think we recognize that new businesses, especially on the social infrastructure side, like healthcare and education, don't carry with it the same amount of scale that a telco company has or an infrastructure business would have. So you give it that leeway as well, that it doesn't need to meet your scale requirements.
Joanna, do you want to make any comment? And then I'll draw the panel to a close.
Yeah, just the last. I'd just like to add that I agree with Rico and what the other panelists have said, especially in terms of building small and enterprises in the patient funding, of course. But then sometimes what they need is not, necessarily like a big chunk of funding, but it's also building the capacity, so other in-kind forms of support, not just that. And in terms of our role at the foundation, we see ourselves as having a bridging role. So what the support that we ask, if we do, is not actually for us, but for the communities that we help. So in the areas that we work with, we'd be happy to work with in terms of education. School feeding sometimes turns into a catalyst in that the local group starts out with school feeding and then it branches out into other education issues. And of course, in terms of agriculture, that's really something that needs a lot of help in the Philippines. Agriculture, it's not as developed as it should be, and in terms of research and development and other areas, that's really a space that has a lot of room for development.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So on behalf of AVPN, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. Could you give the panelists a round of applause? Thank you very much. And Senator Aquino did send his apologies. He really wanted to be here. He very much supports the work of these organizations, but also building the connectivity that we were talking about between the Philippines and other countries. So thank you very much. Enjoy your break and have a good day.